2:44 a.m. Red Sea, 180 nautical miles northwest of the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, USS Carney was conducting its 43rd consecutive day of maritime security operations in the southern Red Sea corridor. The Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer had intercepted 14 Houthi ballistic missiles and 23 drone systems since its deployment. Its crew had processed more than 300 radar tracks classified as potential threats in 43 days. They were experienced. They were also operating at a tempo that no U.S. naval vessel had sustained in a contested environment since the 1991 Gulf War. The engagement rate was not theoretical. It was daily. The crew had learned to read the radar signatures the way a surgeon reads an imaging result. Pattern recognition built from repetition, calibrated against the cost of error. At 2:44 a.m., the pattern broke. The Houthi Aerospace Force, the operational designation that the Yemen-based organization had adopted in its own communications for the unit responsible for its ballistic missile program, had been studying Carney's interception geometry for 11 days. Every engagement produced data. The missile that flew and was intercepted told the Houthi technical advisors, through signals intelligence monitoring of the Aegis fire control radar's transmission patterns, where in the engagement envelope the SM-2 and SM-6 solutions were being built, what the intercept geometry looked like from the ship's perspective and, crucially, what a trajectory profile would look like that compressed the Aegis system solution building window to the point where the engagement geometry became marginal. The Houthi program's technical assistance came from a source that the U.S. intelligence community had been documenting for 22 months. A cadre of Iranian IRGC Aerospace Force technical personnel who had been present in Yemen since 2021 and whose expertise was not in building missiles but in optimizing their employment against specific defensive system architectures. The Burken 3 ballistic missile that had been used in all previous operations carried a standard re-entry vehicle with a predictable terminal geometry. The round that launched at 2:44:07 a.m. did not. The modification was not a new missile. It was a trajectory alteration, a steepened re-entry angle that compressed the terminal phase timeline, combined with a maneuver at the boundary of the Aegis radar's acquisition geometry that delayed the fire control solution by approximately 4.2 seconds. Against a standard SM-2 Block 3B engagement, 4.2 seconds was the difference between an intercept at 22 kilometers and an intercept at 9 kilometers. Against a ship whose close-in defense layer was the phalanx CIWS, 9 kilometers meant the CIWS was the primary engagement rather than the backup. USS Carney's Aegis system acquired the modified Burken 3 at 2:44:19 a.m., 12 seconds after launch, at a range of 187 kilometers. The fire control system began building its SM-2 engagement solution at 2:44:22 a.m. At 2:44:44 a.m., 22 seconds into the solution building process, the incoming round executed its trajectory alteration maneuver. The fire control system's predictive algorithm required 4.1 seconds to update its solution geometry after the maneuver. The SM-2 launched at 2:44:49 a.m. with an updated solution that placed the intercept point at 14 kilometers from the ship. The SM-2 missed. The intercept geometry after the trajectory alteration had a closing error of 8.3 meters, within the warhead's effective radius under standard conditions but not under the terminal approach angle that the steepened re-entry had produced. The proximity fuse did not activate. The SM-2 passed 8.3 meters ahead of the Burken 3's path and continued on its ballistic course until fuel exhaustion. Carney's tactical action officer recognized the miss at 2:44:58 a.m. and immediately assigned the CIWS to the surviving contact. The phalanx CIWS opened fire at 2:45:03 a.m. at 1,800 meters range. The Burken 3's re-entry vehicle was moving at approximately Mach 3.8. At 1,800 meters range and Mach 3.8 closing velocity, the CIWS had approximately 1.6 seconds of engagement window before the round's predicted impact point. The phalanx fired 127 rounds in that 1.6-second window. 41 impacted the re-entry vehicle. The impact shattered the vehicle's structural integrity and altered its terminal trajectory by approximately 7 degrees. Not a neutralization, a deflection. The Birkin III's re-entry vehicle, structurally compromised and on a deflected trajectory, impacted USS Carney's portside midship section at 2:45:05 a.m. The impact point was the 03 level, just forward of the ship's vertical launch system magazine. The warhead, a 200-kilogram high explosive unitary design, detonated on impact with the ship's outer hull plating. The detonation produced a structural breach approximately 2.1 meters in diameter in the portside hull at the 03 level. The blast propagated inward through 2 interior compartments before the structural geometry of the magazine's armored boundary wall contained the overpressure. The VLS magazine was not penetrated. The ship's propulsion was not affected. Primary power was not lost. 8 personnel in the 2 affected compartments sustained injuries from the blast overpressure and structural fragment dispersal. 3 were assessed as serious. 5 were moderate to minor. The ship's damage control team reached the breach at 2:45:47 a.m., 42 seconds after impact. Boundary cooling was applied to the magazine wall at 2:46:11 a.m. as a precautionary measure. The fire suppression system in the affected compartments activated automatically at 2:45:07 a.m. The fires were suppressed by 2:48:33 a.m. USS Carney reported at 2:49:01 a.m. Structural breach sustained, 8 personnel injured, magazine boundary intact, propulsion and primary systems operational, combat capable at reduced capacity. A U.S. naval vessel had been struck by a hostile ballistic missile and sustained significant structural damage. It was the first time a U.S. warship had been damaged by hostile fire since USS Samuel B. Roberts struck a mine in the Persian Gulf in 1988, 37 years earlier. The number lived in the institutional memory of every surface warfare officer in the U.S. Navy. The tactical action officer on Carney knew the number. He logged it in his damage report without comment. The NAVCENT Operations Watch at NSA Bahrain received Carney's damage report at 2:49:18 a.m. The watch commander initiated the emergency notification cascade simultaneously with the activation of the standing contingency plan that NAVCENT had maintained for a Houthi ballistic missile strike on a U.S. naval vessel. The plan had existed for 19 months. It had been updated 6 times. It had been hoped by everyone who had written and revised it that it would never be needed. At 2:51:44 a.m., NAVCENT transmitted activation authority for Operation RED MERIDIAN to the Combined Air Operations Center. The operations targeting database covered every cataloged element of the Houthi missile program's infrastructure across western Yemen. 28 ballistic missile storage and maintenance facilities in the Sana'a, Hodeidah, and Hajjah governorates, 11 mobile transporter erector launcher support sites, 7 radar and targeting coordination facilities, 4 Iranian IRGC technical advisory compound locations assessed with high confidence through signals intelligence collection, and the coastal defense battery positions that the Houthi organization had used to threaten commercial shipping in the Red Sea. Total aim points across the target set: 197. The operation had been pre-planned for simultaneous operational delivery across all aim points within a 90-minute window. The assets available for Red Meridian activation were not the full complement the operations planners had originally designed around. USS Carney was the ship that had been struck, and it retained combat capability, but its reduced operational status meant it was assigned to damage control priority rather than offensive operations. USS Mason, operating 140 kilometers north of Carney's position, had a full VLS load. USS Gravely, which had transited the Bab el-Mandeb 31 hours earlier and was operating in the southern Red Sea, carried 64 Tomahawk land attack missiles. USS Bataan, the amphibious assault ship operating as the Red Sea Task Force's aviation platform, had EA-18G Growlers embarked from a temporary aviation detachment that had been placed aboard 62 days earlier specifically because NAVCENT had assessed that a kinetic response to a successful Houthi engagement of a U.S. vessel would require electronic warfare support. And USS Dwight D. Eisenhower, operating in the Gulf of Aden 280 kilometers to the south, had a full carrier air wing and a direct routing to the Yemen target sets. The decision process that produced Red Meridian's authorization at 2:51 a.m. was not a reaction to the Carney impact. It was the activation of a pre-existing authorization structure that had been maintained specifically because the U.S. Navy's planning community had assessed a successful Houthi ballistic missile engagement of a U.S. vessel as a probable contingency. Not certain, but probable enough to warrant a pre-authorized response package that could be activated immediately rather than assembled under time pressure. The targeting database had been built and validated over 19 months. The legal authorities had been obtained and maintained in a standing authorization that required only the triggering event to become effective. The forces had been pre-positioned. The EA-18G Growler detachment had been placed aboard USS Bataan 62 days earlier. Not as a routine aviation rotation, but as a deliberate pre-positioning in anticipation of this specific response requirement. The intelligence community had been tracking the IRGC technical advisory presence in Yemen for 22 months and had cataloged the 4 compound locations with sufficient confidence to include them in the target set. Every element of the response had been assembled in advance. The Carney impact had not created the response. It had released it at 3:04 a.m. USS. Gravely launched its first Tomahawk salvo. 14 missiles, target set 1. The ballistic missile storage facilities in the Hajj Governorate assessed as the source of the modified Birkin 3 employment that had struck Carney. The storage facilities had been under continuous surveillance by an MQ-9 Reaper since the Carney engagement, which had maintained its orbit when the tasking had shifted from surveillance to pre-engagement confirmation. The Tomahawks were in the air at 3:04:22 a.m. Flight time to the Hajj targets approximately 41 minutes. While the first Tomahawks were in flight, the electronic warfare preparation phase was activating. The EA-18G Growler detachment launched from USS Bataan at 3:06 a.m. and established a jamming architecture over western Yemen's radar network. The Houthi organization's air defense architecture was not sophisticated, primarily Soviet-era radar systems that had been maintained and operated by IRGC technical advisors rather than Houthi personnel, supplemented by more modern short-range systems that Iran had supplied in disassembled form over the preceding 4 years. The Growler's ALQ-99 jamming pods activated against the primary radar frequencies at 3:09 a.m. The radar network's coverage degraded within 3 minutes to a level that reduced its ability to provide targeting updates to any surviving mobile systems. The F/A-18E and F-35C elements of the Eisenhower's air wing launched at 3:08 a.m. and established their ingress corridors toward the Sana'a Governorate target sets, the largest concentration of Red Meridian's aim points, including 3 ballistic missile maintenance facilities and 2 of the 4 IRGC technical advisory compounds. The ingress took 27 minutes at low altitude over the Red Sea approach. The Eisenhower's mission coordinator had assigned AARGM-ER anti-radiation missiles to the F/A-18Es for radar suppression duty, and AGM-154 joint standoff munitions to the F-35Cs for the hardened storage facilities. The target to munition matching had been pre-computed. The aircrew was executing a plan, not improvising one. The first Tomahawks impacted the Hajj storage facilities at 3:45 a.m. 16 aim points across 4 facilities. The MQ-9 surveillance feed confirmed impacts at 15 of 16 assigned aim points within the planned time on target window. The 16th aim point, a hardened underground section of the primary storage facility that the Tomahawk's penetrating capability was insufficient to reach, was held for re-engagement by the B-2s that had launched from Whiteman Air Force Base at 11 p.m. the previous evening, and were now 63 minutes from their weapon release points carrying GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators. At 3:52 a.m., the Eisenhower's ordnance package reached the SANA target sets. The AARGM-ER engagement of the radar sites at 3:52:44 a.m. was the signal that the strike phase was entering its highest density moment. 7 radar sites in the SANA governorate engaged within a 4-minute window. All 7 went offline before the F-35Cs reached their weapon release points at 3:55 a.m. The AGM-154 glide weapons released from 27 kilometers standoff range, their terminal GPS inertial guidance systems acquiring their assigned aim points without radar interference. The 3 ballistic missile maintenance facilities in the SANA governorate received their ordnance packages between 3:57 and 4:01 a.m. Post-engagement surveillance imagery collected by the repositioned MQ-9 assets would confirm within 90 minutes that all 3 facilities had sustained structural damage assessed as rendering them non-operational for a minimum of 6 to 9 months. The broader target set's munition-to-aim point matching reflected a targeting philosophy that had been refined over 5 planning cycles. The Houthi ballistic missile program's infrastructure was not concentrated. It was dispersed across 3 governorates, with storage facilities in hardened sites, mobile launcher support infrastructure in semi-permanent positions, and radar facilities co-located with other structures in ways that created collateral distance requirements that constrained munition selection. The Tomahawk's JMEWS enhanced payload was matched to the medium hardness storage facilities. The GBU-28 bunker penetrator carried by the B-2S was matched to the 2 deepest underground sections that the JMEWS assessment indicated exceeded the Tomahawk's penetration capability. The AGM-154JSOW glide munition was matched to the surface-accessible maintenance facilities where standoff range was operationally required. The AARGM-ER was matched to every radar emitter in the target set. Each match had been validated by the CAOC's targeting cell against site-specific construction and hardness data derived from synthetic aperture radar imagery updated within 72 hours. The planning had not produced a target list. It had produced a precision engineering document with 197 line items. The IRGC technical advisory compound engagements were the most carefully calibrated element of Red Meridian. Engaging facilities assessed as housing Iranian military personnel required a targeting authority level above the standard delegated authority for Houthi infrastructure. The authority had been pre-delegated under a specific named contingency authorization that had been approved by the National Command Authority 44 days earlier, in anticipation of exactly this scenario. A successful Houthi engagement of a U.S. vessel that required a response comprehensive enough to address the Iranian technical assistance that had made the engagement possible. The authorization covered the 4 compound locations. The ordnance packages assigned to those locations impacted at 4:03 and 4:07 a.m. The signals intelligence collection that had established the locations with high confidence had last confirmed occupancy at 6 p.m. the previous evening. The collection system could not confirm whether the compounds had been evacuated in the hours since. The engagements proceeded on the high confidence occupancy assessment. The B-2s reached their weapon release points at 4:47 a.m. 4 GBU-57 MOP deliveries against the underground sections of the 2 hardest targets in the Hajj and Hodeidah governorates that the Tomahawks had not been able to reach. each munition impacted at 1.5 times the speed of sound. Seismic recording stations at monitoring sites in the region registered events between 2.3 and 2.8 magnitude at each impact point between 4:48 and 4:51 a.m. The post-engagement assessment of penetration effectiveness would take 48 hours of imagery analysis and seismic data interpretation. The preliminary indication was consistent with structural compromise of the underground sections at both facilities. At 5:19 a.m., 94 minutes after the first Tomahawk salvo and 2 hours and 34 minutes after the Birkin III impacted USS Carney's hull, the Red Meridian primary phase was complete. The CAOC's operational assessment indicated 183 of 197 aim points with confirmed engagement. 14 aim points were inconclusive pending post-engagement imagery resolution. The Houthi ballistic missile storage and maintenance infrastructure across western Yemen had been engaged at a scale and simultaneity that the organization's reconstitution capability, assessed against known Iranian supply chain timelines, would require between 8 and 14 months to restore to pre-operation status. USS Carney remained on station. Its damage control teams had completed temporary patching of the hull breach by 4:30 a.m. The ship was no longer a fully operational asset in the sense of the previous 43 days. Its crew of 281 was intact except for the 8 injured, 3 of whom had been transferred by helicopter to USS Baton's medical facility at 3:15 a.m. The ship's commanding officer transmitted his status report at 5:21 a.m. Damage control complete. Reduced combat capability, all critical systems operational, ready to continue operations on command authority direction. The 37-year gap since the last U.S. warship had been struck by hostile fire was a number that the naval establishment had not processed as a planning assumption. It had not been explicitly assumed that no U.S. vessel would be struck. The planning community had worked the contingency for years. But 37 years without an incident had produced an institutional landscape in which the Carney impact was simultaneously expected in the planning documents and surprising in the operational reality. The 8 injured personnel, the hull breach, the 42-second response by the damage control team, the 3-minute suppression of the fires, the temporary patching completed before dawn. All of it had been pre-planned, pre-drilled, pre-trained. And all of it had been activated for the first time in 37 years on a Tuesday morning in the Red Sea by a missile that had been specifically engineered to defeat the system that should have stopped it 11 kilometers further out. The 4.2-second window that the trajectory alteration had created, the gap between an SM-2 intercept at 22 kilometers and a deflected impact at the hull, was a product of 19 months of technical observation by Iranian advisors who had studied every Carney engagement and built a targeting solution from the data. The gap had been 4.2 seconds wide. The CIWS had compressed it to a structural breach and 8 injuries rather than a catastrophic outcome. 427 rounds fired in 1.6 seconds. 41 impacts. A 7-degree deflection that changed the warhead's final impact point by enough to miss the magazine boundary wall. The commanding officer also transmitted a second report at 5:22 a.m. A report that did not go to NAVCENT but went directly to the Chief of Naval Operations under the Personal for Commander reporting protocol. It contained one sentence beyond the standard damage report format. It noted that the modified trajectory profile employed against his vessel had been a technically sophisticated evolution of the standard Birkin III employment that the U.S. Navy had been tracking and defending against for the preceding 19 months. It recommended that the technical parameters of the modification be immediately distributed to every Aegis-equipped vessel in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden, and that the SM-2 engagement algorithm parameters for this specific threat class be updated before any further Houthi ballistic missile employment could be attempted. The recommendation was acted upon. The updated engagement parameters were transmitted to the theater's Aegis ships at 6:14 a.m., 43 minutes after the commanding officer's report. 7 months later, the same modified trajectory profile was employed by a second Houthi launch attempt against a different U.S. vessel in the same operational area. The SM-2 engagement, using the updated algorithm, intercepted the round at 24 kilometers. The ship was undamaged. Time from Birkin 3. Impact to Red Meridian authorization. 6 minutes 43 seconds. Time from authorization to first Tomahawk launch. 12 minutes 22 seconds. Red Meridian aim points engaged. 183 of 197. Confirmed non-operational assessments. 149. Inconclusive. 34. Houthi ballistic missile program reconstitution timeline estimate 8 to 14 months. U.S. personnel injuries 8 total aboard USS Carney, 3 serious. USS Carney operational status reduced capability, mission continuing. First U.S. warship struck by hostile fire since 1988. Confirmed. Last U.S. warship struck by hostile fire after Red Meridian. The question the operation was designed to answer.